Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the Relative Strength Index, or RSI. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. The Relative Strength Index, used by itself, in my opinion, is not the best idea. But I do think it can be used in confluence with other indicators to help provide some insight into the market. There's this idea of, if the RSI is above 70, it's overbought, and if it's below 30, it's oversold. Now, if you use the RSI, the weekly RSI, to just simply buy Bitcoin every few years, whenever the weekly RSI goes below 30, you would actually be doing quite well. Okay. However, the reverse is not necessarily true in terms of going above 70. And you can see there's examples when the RSI on the weekly goes above 70, and while it might pop back down below the 70 level, it can stay overbought for months, quarters, and sometimes even years before durably going back down to the lower part of that range between, say, 30 to 70. And so I want to talk a little bit about where the weekly RSI is right now, and where has that lined up in the context of history. So if you guys think back to earlier this year, back in March, we talked about this idea of a summer lull, right? Where basically, Bitcoin tops out potentially 1 month before the halving, just like ETH topped out a local top again 1 month before its merge, and then it put in a couple of lower highs after that before picking back up. We talked about that idea, about this summer lull. And so it got me thinking, now that, it's here. I mean, Bitcoin's below 60K, which I don't really think a lot of analysts had on their bingo card for this year. Now that it's actually back below 60K, I was wondering, well, where is the weekly RSI? And does it actually correspond to where it was last year at this time? We've also talked a little bit about other comparisons as well. We've made the comparison to 2013 and 2016 and 2019, and of course 2023. But I just want to show you where the weekly RSI is right now. So we're just going to draw a line across the page and just simply look at prior times when the weekly RSI came down to this level. Now, coincidentally, this is the level that the weekly RSI hit back in the summer of 2023. You can see that we got this move down in early August. Bitcoin then spent several weeks, in fact, below its bull market support band. Now, back then, I was looking at this as a potential comparison to 2019 because we also fell below the bull market support band in Q3 of that pre-halving year, which is exactly the same thing that's happened every Q3 of every pre-halving year. Bitcoin falls below its bull market support band. If you don't believe me, again, this is crypto. Don't trust, verify. You can see that it did happen last year. Q3 of the halving year, we saw Bitcoin drop below the 20-week SMA, so that ended up coming true. But the reason that we talked about that idea was because it did the same thing in 2019, and it did the same thing in 2015, in Q3 of the pre-halving year, and then also in Q3 of 2011. And so it seemed like this was, this pattern that was just continuing to play out. And so one of the ideas that we talked about was going below the bull market support band, like we did over here in 2019, consolidating for a few weeks, and then going back up to the 20-week moving average. You see that? That's what happened in 2019. Now, in 2019, Bitcoin got rejected by the 20-week SMA. In 2023, you can see that it actually got through. But what's interesting as it relates to the relative strength index, you can see that not only was this the support level that we had in 2023, which is where we are right now, it's also the support level that Bitcoin hit in 2019 when it fell in Q3 of the pre-halving year. And what's interesting is if you go look at the bounce that Bitcoin had back up to that bull market support band, the 20-week SMA, 21-week EMA, and you draw a line across the screen at that sort of rejection, you can see that after coming back down to this level, Bitcoin's weekly RSI a month or so later moved back up to that same level that it hit in 2019. You see that? It was the same level. The main difference, though, was that in 2019, Bitcoin got rejected from that level and then went to a lower weekly RSI. In 2023, it did not get rejected. I mean, it got temporarily rejected from that level, but then it blasted through in Q4 of the pre-halving year. So it basically did the opposite of what happened in 2019 and after the summer lull. In the summer lull of 2019, we followed it up. We extended that lull through Q4. In 2023, we did not extend it, and we ended up getting a Q4 rally. So we find ourselves at a very similar position, right? Where the weekly RSI has dropped back down to around 45 or so. Now, coincidentally, this is also approximately where the weekly RSI was in the summer of 2021, right? You can see that this is where it bounced around, approximately for a couple of months or so. So we find ourselves in a very similar position. Now, remember, when Bitcoin did drop in 2019 to this level, it then basically went sideways for about a month, and then it wicked much lower. It wicked much lower. You see that? It actually went all the way down to around $7,300, right? So the first low that it hit was around $7,700, but then eventually it dropped a little bit lower than that, about another 6% drop from that level. Okay. Now, a lot of what we saw back then has been somewhat tempered in this cycle. For instance, when we dropped below the bull market support band in the summer of 2019, that was a 20% drop. But in 2023, when we dropped below it, it was only a 10% drop, right? So about half. And then this most recent week, when we dropped below it, it was also about a 10% drop. So again, it's not the same level of volatility as 2019. It's like a tempered version of it. At least that's what we've seen so far. So if Bitcoin hangs around sort of in this region for a few weeks, which again, I don't know if it's going to. If you make the comparison to 2013, Bitcoin quickly got back above its 200-day moving average. So far, this time, Bitcoin has been unable to get back above its 200-day SMA. Doesn't mean it's going to. And in fact, at some point, I imagine that Bitcoin will take a substantial stab at getting back above the 200-day SMA. But this is where the weekly RSI is right now, right? It's right around 45, which in 2019 provided some support after we put in a slightly lower low a few weeks later, bounced back up, and then we extended the drop into Q4. Last year, we came to the same level. We moved up, slight rejection, and then we blasted off in Q4. So, and by the way, when this happened over here in 2019, that was after the Fed cut rates, right? So the Fed cut rates in July, and then they continued to cut rates later on that year, and then Bitcoin ended up getting rejected. Last year, what ended up happening is higher for longer prevailed. And what's interesting for me is that I was always in the higher for longer camp. I was I was definitely calling for 5.5% Fed funds rate way back in 2022 when a lot of people thought that there was no way that was going to happen. And I definitely was in the higher for longer camp, but I also was sort of leaning last year that it was repeating 2019 when in fact you can see what happened. Right now, I don't trade this stuff. I got to be honest with you guys. I buy when Bitcoin is at low risk levels, and I take profits when it's at high risk levels. That's all I do. Because I found that over the long term, I'd rather enjoy my life and not stress about these day-to-day movements so much in terms of my own portfolio. So again, if you're looking for that sort of stuff, I would say you just got to come up with a plan, stick to it, and tune everything else out. That's probably going to be better than trying to time the market every single day. But when you look at at this sort of chart, right, you can see that there is at least some repetitiveness of Bitcoin's weekly RSI dropping back down into the mid 40s. And sometimes it finds support, and sometimes it bounces and then loses that support. I think it will probably depend on what's going on over in the rest of the markets, right? What's going on in the stock market, what's going on sort of in the global economy. But we find ourselves at a very similar position. Now, we can also look at this on a 2-week time frame, because I actually think that the RSI is a little bit more useful the longer the time frame that you're using. Now, the first thing I will say is that when you first look at the 2-week RSI, there is a bit of an uncomfortable feeling. All right. And again, guys, I don't control the chart. I really don't, but you can see that the 2-week RSI has tagged this upper trend line. There's this downward trend line that it's tagged near major tops for Bitcoin, right? We tagged it in 2011 and in 2013, and then again later in 2013. We tagged it here in 2017, and then we also tagged it in January of 2021, but then we know that Bitcoin went slightly higher even after that. But again, there's no denying that you look at this, and it probably makes you feel somewhat uncomfortable, right? And that's why, I say, like, it's a good idea, I think, to stick to the risk metrics, because in 2019, the market got somewhat heated, right? It got somewhat heated back over here, and it allowed, if you're following a certain risk metric based on just sort of looking at different things, whether it's on-chain or price, it was extended. You could have taken some off the table if you wanted, and it would have saved you a lot. But over the longer period, who really cares, right? I mean, it dropped 70%, but then, of course, we went up several 100% after that. So it's maybe neither here nor there. But my point here is that we have hit this trend line, right? We have hit this trend line. And it's better to sort of face these things head on rather than pretend like they're not happening, So I would keep an eye on this, because there's only been one cycle where we tagged this trend line and then we tagged it again later on. Every other cycle, it was basically just one and done. Like, once we tagged the trend line, we didn't go back up and tag it after that. At least not for a couple of years, or at least a few years, right? I mean, in 2011, you can see from 2011, it took 2 years, right, after tagging it. Tagging it in November 2013, it took 4 years. From December 2017 till here, it took about 3 years, right? And then January 2021 or so to February 2024, that was 3 years as well. So you can see that you don't often revisit it 6 months later, with the exception of 2013. So then that raises the question, well, where did it find support in 2013? Where did the 2-week RSI find support? And it actually found support precisely at where we currently are. Now, I don't know if it's going to hold this time or not. I really don't. I just think that it is notable. I'll be honest. I mean, I know a lot of people have sort of asked me about whether it's a normal cycle, a left translated peak. There's 3 options, the way I see it, right? There's 3 options. Option 1 is that it's a normal cycle with a peak in Q4 of the post-halving year. That was what we saw the last 3 cycles, right? 2013, 2017, 2021. Okay, so that's option 1. It's a normal cycle where you get a peak Q4 of the post-halving year, which would mean, this was in, March of 2024, which would mean potentially not seeing it tag the trend line again until maybe the end of 2025, which is almost 2 years, which would be kind of similar to what we saw back over here in 2011, where it tagged it in May of 2011 and then tagged it of March of 2013, right? It'd basically be the same thing, except, shifted way over here. So I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but I am just pointing this out, right? This is the level that there was, that the 2-week RSI did in fact find support. But if it finds support here and then goes straight back up to the top trend line, and it doesn't and that's it, then that would mean it could be a left translated peak with a peak at, say, the end of this year, right? So again, it kind of depends on what happens here, right? And and also there does exist a scenario where it holds, but it doesn't go back up to the top of the trend line, right? There's an example like 2016, 2017, where it maybe holds at these levels, but it doesn't really get that explosive move to the upside until 2025. So I would keep an eye on this level, and this level is around 56 or so on the 2-week RSI. Now, there is one sort of uncomfortable thing about this, and that is that, every time that the 2-week RSI hit this trend line, Bitcoin did get a pretty large drop. Even in 2013, when it hit the trend line, while it hit it again later on, technically speaking, it still dropped over 70%. But it also bottomed July 5th, which so far is when the local low is for the most recent drop, July 5th of 2024. But again, you'll see that is ultimately what transpired every single time that Bitcoin hit that trend line, even though sometimes it did go slightly up before then dropping that, 70 to 80% or so. So I don't really know how I feel about this. There's also an example of 2019 where, you go up and then you don't hold support on this level, and then you go all the way back down as the market gets somewhat worried about growth. In 2019, the market was worried about growth as bankruptcies were starting to turn back up. The Fed cut rates to get ahead of that, and there was this sort of this scare in the economy. And then we also had an inverted yield curve back then too, coincidentally, right? I mean, I don't think a lot of people kind of forget about that, but we had an inverted yield curve back in 2019 as well. And so we did have a growth scare, and Bitcoin did not hold it, but then it picked back up the following year. So I think a lot of the characteristics of this market cycle for Bitcoin is going to really be dependent on what happens at this level. And if you go back and look at just the weekly RSI, right? If you go back and look at the weekly RSI, you can remember, I mean, these lines that I drew were actually based on the 2-week, but you can remember that this is where the weekly RSI held support in 2023, but it's also where the weekly RSI held support in 2019. Right? If you look at 2019, this is where it held support. And while it held support, it still put in a slightly lower low about 3 weeks later. And furthermore, it got rejected by the bull market support band when it did test it. Right? It went back up to it, but it simply got rejected. Now, if you look at the timeline on this, how long did it take to test it? From when we fell below it to the rally back up above the 20-week SMA on a weekly time frame, or on a wick, it took about 4 weeks. If you look at 2023, from when we fell below it, we actually got back up to the 20-week SMA 2 weeks later, but it was just a wick, right? We didn't see a weekly close up there. In order to get back up there with a weekly close, it took about 6 weeks, right? So this time around, if you look at what's happened with Bitcoin so far, right? It just fell below it, and so we're currently just in the first week following that. So, 4 weeks out would put you at the very end of July. 6 weeks out would put you in sort of mid-August or so. But I think that this is going to be a really important spot. Now, of course, the narrative now that everyone's talking about is the German government selling Bitcoin. And what I think is always interesting is that, no matter what price does, people will seek out a narrative to sort of rationalize, right? I remember a few weeks ago, we were talking about the idea of a summer lull. I actually was talking about it in late April, and I said, look, guys, I think we're going to get a summer lull, but normally you get a rally in May 1st before it actually arrives, and then you kind of accept that it's happening. And despite saying that, we got the rally, everyone was freaking out, and then we just dropped like we always do into the summer. So you have to be careful. And then now that it's happened, of course, everyone's sort of racing to figure out why is it happening, right? And now, of course, they're blaming it on the German government for selling Bitcoin. But I do think that maybe the market is quite a bit bigger than a lot of market participants give it credit for. And so, I'll just leave it there, right? I'll leave it there. And I also think that it's fine to be wrong about things. And I mean, I've been wrong about things all the time. It's kind of one of those things that you just sort of have to accept if you're in this industry. If you're trying to talk about financial markets, I mean, you're just going to be wrong a lot. Um, but I will say that this is going to be sort of a critical level for Bitcoin over the next couple of months or so. At least, as it looks at the weekly RSI. Now, if you remember, when you look at the 2-week RSI, if you look at the 2-week RSI, how we said it might lead to some level of discomfort when you look at that, especially if there's not another move back up. But where there might be some, uh, you know, return to comfort, if you go look at the monthly RSI, you can see that it's actually nowhere near that channel, right? That downward sloping trend line, right? It's nowhere near it. In terms of, but again, sort of the counterpoint is that the last time it hit it wasn't until the post-halving year. And the time before that was in the post-halving year. And the time before that was both in the post-halving years. This one over here, of course, was not in a post-halving year. It was a pre-halving year. That was when Bitcoin first launched. So I keep looking at this, right? I mean, again, it's like a puzzle, right? It's like a puzzle. And I wonder, is it going to just go up here by the end of the year and then sort of the left translated peak comes to fruition? Or is it going to pull a 2019 on us and just kind of fade for a little bit longer than people think it's going to? Because in 2019, I mean, you can see that it had a really nice run, but then the weekly or the monthly RSI then faded from June of 2019 until March, right? So coming up here to the high, it dropped for about 9 months. So if it were to do that here, about 9 months would actually put it in December of 2024. So I wonder, if it's going to play out like 2019, you would expect it to at some point retest the bull market support band. And if it gets rejected and you get confirmation that it's kind of 2019 on repeat, then you would look towards maybe the end of the year or say early next year for Bitcoin to sort of pick back up. But if on the other hand, the weekly RSI and the 2-week RSI sort of hold the RSIs hold at these levels and we just go back up in Q4, then I do think there's more evidence for that left translated peak view. But I do think this is really interesting. And I also, I've talked a lot about this. We talked about this a few months ago. I was looking at some tweets on this earlier. But there's a pattern here, right? I mean, you had a green, and then you had a red, and then a green, and then 2 reds, right? Same thing. Green, red, a green, and then 2 reds. So it looks like a similar pattern so far. My guess is that sometime in August, right? Sometime next month, I guess it could happen later this month, but I mean, the market does tend to take its time sometimes. My guess is perhaps sometime in August you'll see it back test the bull market support band, right? It doesn't mean you can't wick up there between now and then, but I could see that happening, right? I could see us trying, doing something like that, and then that's where we figure out what this next Q4 is going to be made of. Because in last year Q4 we saw just another acceleration to the upside. But in Q4 of 2019, it just continued the summer lull, and then we sort of had the pandemic recession scare before QE turned on. The fascinating thing about this for me is that we've talked a lot about Bitcoin dominance and how that's going to play out. And my view, as I've said before, I think dominance is probably going to top in the second half of 2024. But the reason I think it's going to top is because I do think we're going to get interest rate cuts later this year. And I think we're going to pivot back to QE probably maybe in 2025 and maybe even later this year. But, I would say more than likely by sometime in 2025. And so that would then lead to the, to this idea of dominance actually going down. But in the meantime, what we've seen happen with why am I going down this? I always make the video about this. This is about the RSI. I should stick to that. So let's just talk. I mean, again, that's the RSI. And if we pull up, by the way, the so we have the monthly, which, all things considered, you would think that it could theoretically run up higher later on this cycle. It actually does seem to be at it's at this moving average right here. Let me see which moving average that is. So this is the an RSI based MA, I guess on the 14. Yeah, just the 14. So you can see that it's actually just below that, which is actually where it went in 2013, right? But in 2019, it got below it, got right back above, and then of course it collapsed as the economy really started to slow down with the pandemic. But I would look at that, that would still suggest there's more room to theoretically run in the future, although the last 3 times that it did it, it wasn't until the post-halving year. So, are we getting ahead of ourselves by thinking it has to happen now? Maybe. That's the monthly. The 2-week looks a little scary, right? I mean, it looks a little scary if we're being honest. But, I mean, the reality is that eventually we'll hit it again, more than likely. Whether it's this year, next year, or if the other option, by the way, I said the first 2 options, right? Option 1 is that the peak is when it normally is in the post-halving year. Second option, you get a left translated peak in maybe Q4 of this year. Third option, you have a left translated peak where the peak's already in, you know? And there are examples in history where that has happened in, say, like the stock market, where you get a low in the midterm year, you rally on up, and then you top out sometime in the election year. And so there is a chance that, I mean, actually, the dot-com crash started in March. But I think the main evidence sort of against that is that, well, I mean, the S&P has continued higher well past March. Now, Bitcoin hasn't just yet, but the S&P has. And so we do know that the S&P did find a local top in July of last year, just before the 10-year yield ran again. And the 10-year yield ended up topping in October. So that might be the next risk to the stock market, is if the long end of the yield curve starts to move back up. But yeah, I mean, like the monthly RSI for Bitcoin, it looks like there could still be room sometime later on this cycle. The 2-week, it seems like it's cooled off a lot after tagging the top of this trend line. Anyone would probably point out that every time you hit this trend line, Bitcoin had a fairly substantial drop following that trend line. But you could also point out that when we hit this level after tagging in 2013, that's where we found support. On the weekly, we're basically at the same level that we were at in both 2019 and 2023. So if you look at this right here, right? Same level. And this is what got me in trouble last year, is, I was looking at this level here from last year and saying, all right, well, there's a decent chance we're just going to go back up to the bull market support band, get rejected, right? Get rejected. And then see the weekly RSI, then go below it. And it even went up. Again, it looked so close to it, right? It really did. It went right back up to that level, saw a temporary rejection, and then we just blasted through it in Q4. So, weekly looks really similar to 2023, but also looks similar to 2019. I would say the main difference between now, I'm going to end up talking about it anyways, even though I tried not to. I really tried not to. You have to give me credit for that, but we're going to talk about it. Alt Bitcoin pairs, right? That's one of the differences, is that, in 2023, alt Bitcoin pairs had just sort of gotten down into this range. The same range that they sort of reached by September of 2018, and then ultimately they fell through in the summer of the pre-halving year. So last time that Bitcoin ended up bouncing back up, it was when alt Bitcoin pairs first got down to this level. Now, I think my light is flickering. Now, we've been at these levels for about a year now, and alt Bitcoin pairs are really starting to struggle to stay above this 0.4 level. I mean, right now they're at 0.4, but it's sort of like this 0.4 level has been sort of a FUD level for a lot of people that say that it's never going to happen. And now you get rallies back up to 0.4 and people are getting excited. But, I would say you look at the 8-week SMA on this, and there's a decent chance the 8-week SMA is guiding alt Bitcoin pairs down. So that's what I would keep an eye on. Do alt Bitcoin pairs break down like 2019, or do they hold and do something like we saw in 2023? So that's where we are right now. I also think, just because we have it up, if you look at the weekly RSI on alt Bitcoin pairs, you can see that there was this level of sort of support that was, we had a low, we had a higher low, we had a higher low, but now you're essentially, you can see that basically alt Bitcoin pairs sort of broke through that. And maybe they're trying to back test that trend line. I don't know. I think it's extremely dubious to draw trend lines on that sort of stuff. But I do think that, in 2019, we saw something very similar, right? We saw alt Bitcoin pairs basically climb this thing. They dropped below it. We got a rally. It fell short. And then we actually saw alt Bitcoin pairs sell off in July and August and September of 2019. And then they finally went into that oversold region, right? So, and basically you could even connect the dots, right? This dot to that one where they finally bottomed. Um, and so I just wonder if something like that is ultimately going to play out again, where alt Bitcoin pairs sort of fade. And a lot of the reason for that is just, I think a lot of people have been surprised by how long this Bitcoin dominance rally has gone on for. But I also think the reason is because a lot of people didn't really believe the Fed, right? Higher for longer. No, a lot of people didn't really believe them, and they meant what they said. And so the higher risk assets just keep on bleeding to the lower risk assets. So that's where we stand with Bitcoin and the relative strength index. Again, my sort of recommendation on things like the RSI is that it's probably better to figure out if you're going to use the RSI for anything, you're probably better off using it to figure out when to buy than when to sell, right? Because again, if you only ever use the RSI to say, all right, whenever the weekly RSI goes below 30, it's time to DCA, right? If you did that, you'd be fine. If, on the other hand, you sold every time it went above 70, then that effectively means you're selling Bitcoin here and here and here, right? You can see the issue with it, right? I mean, like that's the issue if you're using the weekly RSI to try to figure out when you should sell, right? Buying, on the other hand, tends to be a bit of a better, better track record. Selling, not so much. Sometimes it's okay, like 2019, but other times, if once you hit these levels, it's really hard to know how long it'll stay up in this level. And again, it can stay overbought for months before it comes back down. So that's where we stand. Hopefully this has been useful in terms of figuring out where we are in the market cycle with Bitcoin and the weekly RSI, the daily or the weekly, the 2-week, and the monthly. The only other thing I guess we didn't look at that might be interesting is the daily. I don't even know. I imagine it's oversold right now. No, it's not. But it's close. I mean, it came really close, right? I mean, so you had a low here it was oversold, right? Back in June 24th, and then a higher low. So I guess it's forming some type of divergence there, right? Where you're again, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this, but you have higher lows on the RSI and lower lows on price. So I think the experts would call that bullish divergence. I think. But again, like the issue is that, just because you're oversold doesn't mean price can't go lower. And I mean, I remember people saying that, look, the RSI is oversold, therefore 60K was the bottom. And now we're sitting at 56K, right? And the RSI is higher. It's the same. Damn, I'm going to talk about it. It's the same thing as Bitcoin dominance. It's the same thing. Like, I've had so many people tell me that, the weekly RSI is way up here, and that it means that it's going to go down, but then it never really does. Anyways, we'll go ahead and wrap it up there, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.